The 10,038th meeting of the Security Council is called to order. The provisional agenda for this meeting is Report of the Secretary General on the Sudan and South Sudan. The agenda is adopted. In accordance with Rule 37 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the representative of South Sudan to participate in this meeting. It is so decided. In accordance with Rule 39 of the Council's Provisional Rules of Procedure, I invite the following briefers to participate in this meeting. Mr. Jean-Pierre Lacroix, Under Secretary General for Peace Operations. Ms. Sima Sami Bahos, Executive Director, UN Women, and Dr. Solomon Ayale Dresso, Executive Director, Amani Africa Media and Research Services. It is so decided. The Security Council will now begin its consideration of item 2 of the agenda. I wish to draw the attention of Council members to document S/2025/706, the report of the Secretary General on the situation in South Sudan. I now give the floor to Mr. Jean-Pierre Lacroix.
Just to indicate that we are not getting the audio from the side of the council.
Yeah, same for me. I'm not getting the audio either.
We can hear you. And Mr. Lacroix, you have the floor. I will propose that we proceed with the briefing by Ms. Sima Sami Bahos, and I'll give the floor to Ms. Sima Sami Bahos.
Thank you. Mr. President, Excellencies, I thank the Sierra Leone Presidency for inviting me to brief you today. South Sudan's path to peace and development is beset by political instability, humanitarian crises, and socio-economic fragility. The country contends with weakened institutions and struggles with social cohesion, all as the ongoing war in neighboring Sudan further destabilizes its fragile transition. Since April 2023, over 1.2 million people have crossed into South Sudan, straining South Sudan's systems and capacities, complicating humanitarian delivery, and making mediation and cooperation more difficult. As always in crises and conflict, women and girls are hit hardest. Every day they face relentless climate challenges, food insecurity, sexual violence, abductions, and more. South Sudan has one of the highest rates of gender-based violence in the region, with an estimated 2.7 million people at risk. 2024 saw UNMISS document 260 cases of conflict-related sexual violence, including rape, gang rape, sexual slavery, forced abortion, and forced marriage, with the highest number recorded in Western Equatoria State. Forced displacement, especially of women and children, increase their vulnerability, while resource scarcity and livelihood pressures fuel ethnic tensions, driving intercommunal violence and increasing vulnerability to gender-based violence, particularly in border areas. For South Sudan's young people, the impacts are acutely gendered. Young women and girls face forced marriages and sexual violence. Young men and boys are enticed or forced to join armed groups as a means of survival. Despite all this, despite a well-documented reality of fragility, it is now that the UN's work in South Sudan becomes ever more pressured. It is now that mandates are questioned, now that resources are withdrawn. As Under-Secretary General Lacroix will highlight, the UN's work in South Sudan is more critical than ever. Displaced women and girls depend upon it for basic necessities such as shelter, food, and water. Women and girls depend on the protection patrols or the GBV partnerships of UN Women and UNFPA to support them. They depend on the United Nations and on UN Women in particular to support their call for a seat at the table, their mediation contributions, or for their voices and agency in peace processes. In case all this seems abstract, I share with you just one example. A few months ago, a group of armed youth surrounded a girls' boarding school in Warab state. They sought revenge for a cattle raid. 100 schoolgirls were trapped inside. They feared abduction, or worse. They feared it with good reason. Fortunately, UN peacekeepers intervened. They de-escalated the situation. They freed the girls. For those 100 girls, those peacekeepers could not have been more essential, nor their courage and skill more life-changing. Those 100 girls would find it incomprehensible that the mandates and resources behind those peacekeepers might somehow be in question. Excellencies, in this fragile environment, withdrawal of resources and capacity is imprudent at best, catastrophic at worst. And we know who will shoulder the inevitable burdens that come with this investment. It will be women, women who are first responders on the front line, caregivers for their families, sustainers of their communities, all while facing a perfect storm of economic, climate, and conflict-related threats. They deserve better. We owe them better. Mr. President, distinguished members of the Security Council, it has been 7 years since the signing of the peace agreement. Those 7 years have seen delayed elections, constitutional reforms that safeguard citizens' rights, including gender equality, behind schedule, the unification of forces incomplete, and strong legal frameworks, social protection systems, and transitional justice unrealized. The same is true for progress on women's leadership and role in peace and security. It is regrettable that the second National Action Plan on Women, Peace and Security, developed over a year and a half ago, still awaits approval. The 35% gender quota, which has so much potential to drive transformation for the better, is not yet a reality. Ceasefire monitors are overwhelmingly male. In the Nairobi peace talks, only 2 of the 18 delegates were women. All 10 governors are male. Only 20% of deputy governors are female, and women hold only 18% of judicial positions. I recognize that 2 vice presidents are women and that 40% of the political party's council is female. I hope that this proves to be a foundation for the quota to be extended also to the cabinet, to the national and state parliaments, the Council of States, the National Elections Commissions, and the Constitutional Review Commission. Excellencies, women's full and meaningful representation must be the norm in South Sudan, from community reconciliation platforms to national and regional decision-making spaces. At the grassroots level, women forge local peace agreements between communities from different ethnic groups, resolve land conflicts or grazing conflicts between farmers and herders, intervene to stop cattle raids, and collect small weapons from young men and boys. That is why I urge all parties to ensure that the 35% agreed quota is met immediately, including for upcoming appointments of the Commission for Truth, Reconciliation and Healing, and the Compensation and Reparation Authority. There is simply no more proven pathway to sustainable peace than women's leadership and meaningful inclusion in conflict resolution. I call on the Security Council to maintain support for the UN in South Sudan, including its work on gender equality. I call on the Security Council resolutions and negotiations on budget to maintain that same gender lens. Cuts in funding have already been devastating for women and girls. shutting down health clinics, nutrition treatment sites, and safe houses. They have jeopardized the crucial work of women's organizations working on peace and social cohesion. There could be no worse time to withdraw such support. Excellencies, however different the circumstances, UN Women will continue to work alongside all its partners, the African Union, IGAD, UNMISS, and more, to advance peace, justice, and stability. We do so because we are all united in the belief that the women and men, boys and girls of South Sudan must wait no longer. I join with our partners in calling on all parties to ensure that international humanitarian law and international human rights law be upheld and respected. And I remind us all that throughout conflicts and the building of peace, the women of South Sudan have been as resolute as they have been inspirational. They have shown leadership, courage, and conviction. They have advanced the women, peace, and security agenda with unwavering resolve. Their advocacy, their work at the grassroots, and more have never mattered more. They model for us what can be done. They show us what happens when women lead. And if our truest ambitions for South Sudan are that it be peaceful and prosperous, then there can be no higher priority for our support than women. Thank you.
I thank Ms. Bowles for a briefing. I'll now give the floor to Mr. Jean-Pierre Lacroix.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. Mr. President, I thank you for the opportunity to brief you and the Council on the situation in South Sudan, which demands not only our attention, but our collective action as well. This briefing is additionally informed by my visit to the country from 15 to 17 October. And let me also associate myself fully with the statement just pronounced by the Executive Director of UN Women, my friend and colleague Sina Bahaus. And I thank her for the excellent cooperation between UN Women and UN peacekeeping. Over the past 3 months, the developments in South Sudan continued to move in a negative and possibly dangerous direction. Ceasefire violations are on the increase, including widespread aerial bombardments and clashes between the signatories of the peace agreement. With the unilateral removal of opposition appointees in the transitional government of national unity in violation of the peace agreement. First, Vice President Bashar and opposition leaders allied to him remain detained and on trial. And the effects of the conflict in Sudan continue to spill over the border, inflaming local tensions, placing strain on already scarce resources of the government and the international actors in the country. As a result of all this, the trust deficit between key role players has widened as the peace process seems to be unraveling. Mr. President, despite these challenges and a breaking point becoming visible, the revitalized peace agreement remains the only viable framework for long-term peace and stability in South Sudan. The principle of inclusivity that underpinned the agreement in general and the power-sharing arrangement in particular appear to have been sacrificed in the wave of repeated unilateral decisions. In this context, the emergence of breakaway factions could raise questions about the viability after future elections conducted under these circumstances. The detention and ongoing trial of senior SPLM-AIO leaders, including first Vice President Bashar, has further polarized the political environment. While I will not comment on the legal merits of the case, I must stress that adherence to due process and fairness and transparency of the trial is critically important if public confidence is to be maintained and the trial does not serve as a trigger for violence. Institutions designed to foster partnerships are under-resourced and faltering. In the absence of dialogue, mistrust is hardening, and any remaining space for compromise is fast diminishing. As a result, the implementation of the transitional security arrangements remains stalled, and little progress has been observed in the constitution-making process. The transitional period of the peace agreement is expected to conclude after elections in December 2026. Much has been stated about the intent to hold these long-awaited elections, but there is little to show in terms of concrete steps undertaken. With time running out for credible planning, key electoral decisions must be made now, not later. However, this requires genuine political negotiations and compromise. In this regard, we call for the resumption of the government-led joint task force with UN, AU, IGAD, and Troika to support the prioritization and resourcing of the constitutional making and electoral processes. I concur fully with the call of the African Union Peace and Security for IGAD as guarantor of the peace process and neighboring states to re-energize efforts to ensure implementation and accountability for commitments made in the peace agreement. As credible and peaceful elections within the timelines of the peace agreement in December 2026 appear increasingly improbable, fresh political commitment and dialogue between the leaders of South Sudan are therefore essential. Political commitment and dialogue between the leaders of South Sudan are absolutely critical for the country to move forward, including on key political processes contemplated by the peace agreement. Mr. President, the humanitarian situation remains catastrophic. More than 7.5 million people face acute food insecurity. 28,000 are at risk of famine. Flooding has displaced over 1 million. Over 1.2 million returnees and refugees from Sudan have crossed into a country already struggling to feed its own. Human suffering during this volatile situation continues to mount. Conflict-related sexual violence, arbitrary detentions, and extrajudicial killings persist with limited accountability. I urge all parties to immediately cease hostilities and recommit to the cessation of hostilities agreement. Despite insecurity and rising bureaucratic impediments, humanitarian partners bravely continue to deliver assistance, often at great personal risk. I call on the government to lift access restrictions, guarantee the safety of aid workers, and hold to account all those involved in attacks on humanitarian workers. Mr. President, these political and security upheavals can coincide with the financial crisis for the United Nations and peacekeeping in particular. UNMISS, like other missions, face difficult challenges to meet ambitious mandates with diminishing needs. Since its inception in 2011, UNMISS has operated through two civil wars in 2013 and 2016 and saved hundreds of thousands of lives under its protection of civilian mandate, maintained 6 protected civilian sites hosting up to 250,000 IDPs for over 7 years, and implemented its other mandated activities outlined in the remaining 3 pillars of the mandate. As things stand, the mission continues to maintain a protection of civilian sites in Malakal and provide security support to humanitarian actors managing the IDP camps that were designated from being POC sites. The facts on the ground prove that the presence of the mission in South Sudan was and remains essential to maintain peace and stability to the extent possible till the end of the transition period. While the current liquidity crisis will greatly impact the ability of the mission to protect civilians and deliver on the rest of its mandate, UNMISS continues to be a critical actor in South Sudan to protect civilians and support all efforts aimed at maintaining peace and stability in the country, again, to the extent possible, and in a region that is massively affected by conflict. In this context, the contingency plan, applied across all UN peacekeeping operations to address liquidity challenges, is now being implemented in UNMISS. This plan entails the closure of certain field offices and bases, the repatriation of uniformed personnel, which has already begun, and reductions of national and international staff. During my recent visit to Juba, I informed the government of South Sudan, including President Salva Kiir, of these measures, emphasizing the financial imperatives driving this exercise. I stressed that despite the impact of the plan, downsizing and office and base closures, UNMISS remains fully committed to prioritizing protection, facilitating humanitarian assistance, and fulfilling its mandated task, ensuring that the gains achieved since the deployment of the mission are not undermined, while continuing to support the government in fulfilling its responsibility to protect its citizens. While I receive assurances from President Kiir and several ministers that the host government recognizes the difficult circumstances facing UNMISS and would support the mission in implementing its plan, Only days later, the mission received a formal document from the government outlining a series of conditions that are not only impractical, but pose a serious threat to the viability of the contingency plan and potentially to the mission itself. Unless there is a greater understanding and flexibility from the government, the mission's ability to fulfill its mandate will be severely compromised, and frankly, the future of that mission is totally at stake. We remain committed to working closely with the government to ensure the swift implementation of this exercise, which is primarily intended to allow us to continue executing our mandate for the benefit of peace, stability for the people of South Sudan. In this regard, we call for the support of the government, which remains key for progress ahead. However, let me reiterate, the status of forces agreement must be respected, and the safety of UN personnel and assets must be guaranteed. We also count on the continued support of the Council in this regard. Mr. President, to conclude, implementation of the revitalized agreement remains South Sudan's only path to stability and lasting peace. But time is running dangerously short, and there is an urgent need to bring the peace process back on track. We hope this Council will send a clear message in this regard. The parties must take a citizen-centric approach, reinvigorate their commitment to political inclusion, and cease unilateral actions. Furthermore, we as regional actors and the international community must remain united and engaged. At a time of global uncertainty, developments next door in Sudan, particularly in Darfur, serve as a reminder that peacekeeping is an investment in international peace and security. The region simply cannot afford another conflict, causing more suffering to the people of South Sudan, who have suffered far too much and for far too long. Thank you.
I thank Mr. Lokwa for his briefing. I now give the floor to Dr. Solomon Ayeli Dasso.
Thank you very much, Mr. President, to you and Sierra Leone's presidency for the invitation extended to me to deliver this briefing representing my organization, Amani Africa Media and Research Services. I would like to recognize with appreciation the previous briefers. Amani Africa, Pan-African Policy Research, Training and Consulting think tank that works on multilateral policy processes of concern and interest for Africa, is a leading source of information and analysis on complex situations in Africa on the agenda of both the African Union Peace and Security Council and this Council. It is therefore an honor for me to draw on Amani Africa's work for my briefing today on South Sudan. Mr. President, South Sudan is at a dangerous crossroads. The country shows all the signs of a clear and present danger of relapsing back to full-scale conflict. Political tensions are mounting. Fighting and insecurity are spreading. The escalation of political tensions and armed fighting since the Nasser incident of March 2025 echoes some of the dynamics that precipitated the relapse of South Sudan back to violent conflict in July 2016. Similar to 2016, and as documented in the Secretary General's report, the deepening political tension manifests itself, among others, in the purge and replacement of senior officials and detention of others. Apart from aggravating political tensions and constitutional uncertainty, these actions constitute, as in 2016, serious violations of the peace agreement, signifying the collapsing of the power-sharing arrangement under the 2018 revitalized peace agreement. The revitalized Joint Monitoring and Evaluation Commission, or JMEC, the body monitoring the revitalized agreement on the resolution of the conflict in South Sudan, observed in its report released last month that, I quote, there is systematic violation of the responsibility sharing arrangements across all crucial bodies, including functionality of the executive and legislature, unquote. These mounting political tensions and constitutional crisis is in part a manifestation of a political scheme for taking a lead position for the elections South Sudan is set to convene at the end of the transition period scheduled in December 2026. And significantly, and as in 2016, The fighting that erupted between the South Sudan People's Defense Forces and armed groups linked to the Sudan People's Liberation Movement in opposition, SPLM-IO, has continued to escalate and expand, as documented in the Secretary General's report and the report from Arjemek, across different states of South Sudan. The fragile peace established under the revitalized agreement on the resolution of the conflict in South Sudan is under grave peril. Arjemek thus mentioned that the violations of the peace agreement, I quote, must be addressed urgently to return the implementation process back on track in order to safeguard the gains of the peace agreement and to prevent a relapse to violence in South Sudan. As in 2016, and the Secretary General's report presented shows, the deteriorating political and security situation is producing further humanitarian distress, aggravating an already dire humanitarian situation facing South Sudanese. The UN OCHA reported recently that, in addition to the existing 2 million internally displaced persons, more than 497,000 people were newly displaced between the beginning of the year and September 2025. The vast majority of them, approximately 321,000, due to the conflict. This clearly attests that South Sudanese civilians are bearing the brunt of the deteriorating political and security situation in the country, highlighting a heightening need for reinforcing measures for the protection of civilians. Mr. President, members of the UN Security Council, the state of the political, security, peace implementation, and humanitarian situation indicates that there are at least 3 pressing issues that require the urgent policy action of this Council. The first of these is arresting the downward political and security spiral and preventing the relapse of the country back to conflict. There is a need for deploying robust and prompt preventive diplomacy. This shouldn't just aim at ending the escalating and spreading conflict. It should also seek to avoid the December 2026 elections from plunging the country back into conflict. This latter point becomes particularly important on account of recent trends in the continent that show that countries with political polarization tend to face the eruption of the political polarization into destabilizing political crisis and violent confrontations during elections. The second pressing issue is restoring the commitment of parties to the 2018 peace agreement and accelerating, as His Excellency Lacroix pointed out, the implementation of transitional tasks, critical to the peaceful conclusion of the transition period with the convening of peaceful and credible elections. Third, the imperative to support the work of the UN mission in South Sudan, particularly in terms of the implementation of the measures required for both enhancing protection of civilians and advancing subnational peacemaking and peace-building efforts. Regarding prevention, Your Excellencies, there are 4 actions available to this Council. First, as previous speakers made it clear, I can't emphasize enough the importance of this Council expressing and availing its full support to the role and ongoing efforts of the trilateral mechanism of the UN, AU, and IGAD plus Arjemek. Second, and perhaps importantly, this Council needs to exercise its enormous influence to nudge the parties into both ending unilateral actions endangering the peace of the country and engaging in dialogue. The Council can accomplish this directly on its own by undertaking a field mission to South Sudan and engaging the parties. Third, and complementing the foregoing, the Council may encourage the UN Secretary General, together with African Union Commission Chairperson, to deploy a joint high-level preventive diplomacy initiative under the UN and African Union Joint Framework Partnership for Peace and Security, including by appointing special envoy. Fourth, this Council may call for an independent investigation of incidents of violations of the revitalized peace agreement, including the March 2025 incident in Nasser, through a mechanism that is put in place as part of the peace agreement by the UN, AU, and IGAD. Regarding the protection of civilians, I urge the Council to take the following measures. First, to call on all armed actors involved in fighting in South Sudan to cease all hostilities, and on the two parties to the revitalized peace agreement to restore full adherence to the permanent ceasefire and transitional security arrangements. Second, the Council should call for respect for all rules of international humanitarian law and human rights law by all armed actors, and demand that armed actors lift the humanitarian access restrictions they imposed and assure the safety of humanitarian workers to enable the urgent delivery of assistance to the affected communities. Third, and finally, this august body should also provide support for and task the UN mission in South Sudan to elevate its preparedness for meeting the potential surge in need for protection, civilian protection in South Sudan. Mr. President, Excellencies, members of the Council, South Sudan has endured so much suffering for far too long. They can't afford the perpetuation of the status quo, let alone the addition to their suffering. They deserve some respite, the least of which that can be done in this respect is to spare them from yet another descent of the country into full-scale war. Prevention of the continuation of the downward spiral of South Sudan is also a regional and international peace and security imperative. With neighboring Sudan under the grip of a brutal war, the region and the international community cannot afford the relapse of South Sudan back to full-scale conflict. Despite the fact that the current global and regional dynamics make your role unenviable, taking the measures listed above and putting South Sudan on a path of concluding its transition peacefully are not beyond your abilities. I urge you to act with urgency and decisiveness and deliver for South Sudanese civilians yearning to be spared from further suffering by preventing South Sudan's collapse back to full-scale civil war. I thank you, Mr. President, and all of you for your kind attention.
I thank Dr. Desso for his briefing. I now give the floor to those council members who wish to make statements. I give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Thank you, President, and thank you to our briefers today. Colleagues, South Sudan is on the brink of a renewed, large-scale civil war. Political violence against South Sudanese citizens is escalating. First Vice President Machar is under arrest, and the transitional government is failing to meet the most basic needs of its citizens. South Sudan's leaders must immediately reverse course. The United States calls on political leaders to engage in direct dialogue and clearly renounce this violence. The international community has provided extraordinary political and economic assistance since South Sudan's independence. The United States alone has contributed over $9 billion in direct bilateral assistance, in addition to billions of dollars more in contributions to international and regional organizations. Unfortunately, the transitional government has not done its part. Far too often, it actively hinders delivery of humanitarian assistance and obstructs UNMISS in their mandated activities and operations. Rather than using public revenue to improve the lives of its citizens, South Sudan's leaders have instead prioritized personal enrichment. Humanitarian needs today are at an all-time high, despite $25 billion in oil revenue since its independence in 2011. Some international organizations have continued with a business-as-usual approach, calling for more donations without calling out the transitional government for its role in South Sudan's largely man-made crisis. It is particularly regrettable when UN agency representatives will not hold the host government accountable for these perpetual practices. The transitional government must start using public revenue to pay salaries to public officials, including security services, and fund health, education, and other essential services. It must also immediately cooperate with UNMISS and cease impeding the mission and harassing its people. The transitional government must also stop obstructing those who facilitate or provide humanitarian assistance and civilian protection. We strongly condemn the seizure of food aid by government security forces and the ambush of UNMISS forces by armed elements in Western Equatoria. In addition, authorities have imposed extra legal fees and denied humanitarian assistance for political purposes. These indefensible actions, along with spreading violence, make South Sudan one of the most difficult and dangerous places in the world to deliver assistance. When South Sudan's leaders make headway tackling corruption and restoring the country's economy and social welfare system, they will begin to restore confidence in the transitional government's commitment to peace, stability, and reconciliation. Such progress will also attract greater support and long-term investment. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the United States for a statement. I now give the floor to the representative of France.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to thank the representative of South Sudan for joining us today. I'd also like to thank Under-Secretary General for Peace Operations, Monsieur Jean-Pierre Lacroix, and the Executive Director of UN Women, Madame Sima Baous, and Dr. Solomon Derso from Amani Africa Media. I'd like to thank them all for their presentations. Your messages converge. The combination of internal difficulties and external pressures place South Sudan in a situation of great fragility. The United Nations provides decisive support to South Sudan, and we must remain mobilized to prevent a return to the civil war. First, as underscored by Monsieur Lacroix, the 2018 Revitalized Peace Agreement remains the only political framework offering a perspective for peaceful development in the country. We call on all actors in South Sudan to fully respect the ceasefire and to re-engage in implementing the peace agreement. We support the repeated calls of the African Union for the cessation of hostilities and for the release of the first Vice President, Riek Machar. Any measures contrary to the revitalized agreement only fuel tensions. Secondly, France expresses its full support for the United Nations mission in South Sudan, UNMISS, as well as for the Special Representative of the Secretary-General, Mr. Nicholas Haysom. We call for an end to the restrictions on his freedom of movement and for full respect of the Status of Forces Agreement. All South Sudanese actors must cooperate with UNMISS, which plays an essential role for the stability of the country and for its people. Thirdly, France calls for full compliance with the arms embargo. South Sudan is located in a region affected by multiple crises that worsen its own security situation, in particular the conflict in neighboring Sudan. France calls on all states to respect the embargo and, where appropriate, to make use of the exemptions provided. Fourth, the international community must continue its support for the people of South Sudan, who are facing forced displacement, violence, flooding, food insecurity, and epidemics, as was underscored by Amani Africa and the representative from UN Women. As Sima Baous pointed out, sexual and gender-based violence is also common, and children are particularly affected by this and by hunger and disease. France condemns repeated attacks against humanitarian personnel who must be protected in accordance with international humanitarian law. Safe and unhindered humanitarian access to populations in need must be guaranteed, and that primarily is the responsibility of the government of South Sudan. Mr. President, peace and prosperity in South Sudan will depend on the drafting of a constitution and the holding of free and fair elections. It is essential that sufficient resources be allocated for the preparation and organization of these elections. which are expected for the end of 2026. Progress is also essential in deploying the necessary unified forces. We call on the South Sudanese authorities to hear the message from this Council and from the African Union and from the international community, and to show itself proactive and to take the necessary measures for the good of the people of South Sudan. Thank you.
I thank the representative of France for his statement. I give the floor to the representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, President. I thank our briefers for their valuable insights, and I welcome the representative of South Sudan in our meeting today. I will make 3 points. First, the United Kingdom remains concerned by the deterioration in the political situation in South Sudan described in the Secretary-General's report. Violations of the revitalized agreement, exclusionary reshuffles, and the systematic sidelining of opposition voices undermine the peace process. We call on the transitional government of South Sudan to urgently recommit to inclusive political dialogue and to restore civic space. The ongoing detention and trial of First Vice President Machar represents a serious risk to South Sudan's fragile peace process. Progress on election preparations should accelerate with meaningful participation from all stakeholders. Second, the volatile security situation, including clashes between the 2 largest parties to the peace agreement, continues to threaten civilians and undermine humanitarian operations. This is happening at a time when the humanitarian crisis is worsening. Flooding since late May has displaced hundreds of thousands and worsened food security, leaving over 7.5 million people struggling to access adequate food. Cholera and the influx of refugees and returnees from Sudan have further strained resources. And while reconciliation efforts have reduced intercommunal violence in some areas, cross-border and cattle-related conflicts persist. The United Kingdom urges all parties to return immediately to the nationwide ceasefire. We further call on the transitional government of South Sudan to remove bureaucratic barriers and allow safe, timely humanitarian access to all areas of South Sudan. Third, the United Nations mission in South Sudan, UNMISS, plays a vital role in protecting civilians, supporting reconciliation, and promoting human rights. It is critical that UNMISS is able to implement its mandate without impediment. So it is deeply regrettable that the mission continues to face violations of the Status of Forces Agreement. The United Kingdom urgently calls on the transitional government of South Sudan to cooperate fully and unequivocally with the mission, including unrestricted access and operational freedom. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom for her statement. I give the floor to the representative of Slovenia.
Thank you, Mr. President. I also thank today's briefers for their briefings. Slovenia reiterates its firm support for UNMISS and pays tribute to the men and women of the mission who continue to serve under difficult and too often dangerous conditions. We strongly condemn all attacks against UNMISS personnel and its assets. As Slovenia slowly reflects on its time in this Council, we look at South Sudan with both deep concern and enduring conviction. Concern for the direction the country is taking, and conviction that the promise of durable peace is achievable. I wish to make 3 points. First, South Sudan's peace must not become another broken promise. The revitalized peace agreement remains the best chance for a stable and inclusive future. We are therefore deeply worried about its steady erosion. The agreed power-sharing arrangements meant to be the heart of the governance are replaced by conflict and armed confrontations, unilateral political actions, and political reshuffles that undermine both trust and compromise. Leadership demands courage to bridge divides. Slovenia therefore calls on all parties to cease hostilities, uphold the permanent ceasefire, return to dialogue, and place the future of the country above factional interests. We note the announcement and subsequent beginnings of trial of opposition figures, including the first vice president. We reiterate, the rule of law must remain the anchor of peace and justice, as justice can only serve peace when it is impartial and transparent. We therefore call for adherence to international standards of fairness, due process, and transparency in all judicial proceedings. Second, the people of South Sudan deserve more than just survival. In South Sudan, the intersection of climate and conflict is no longer only a warning. Conflict, flooding, intercommunal violence, and the war in Sudan have converged into one of the most complex humanitarian crises. The latest IPC reports points to a sharp decline in food security, with hunger tightening its grip as aid barely reaches civilians at risk of famine. We must not wait for another famine declaration to confirm what is already clear. Tens of thousands are living on the edge of catastrophe. All this unfolds as the humanitarian system is stretched to its breaking point. Access is shrinking, insecurity is rising, and resources are increasingly strained. Slovenia strongly condemns all attacks and abductions, targeting humanitarian personnel and looting of their supplies, and calls for safe, unconditional, and unhindered access to all those in need, as well as for safety of all humanitarian workers. Third, the path to peace must be owned by the people of South Sudan. The voices of women, youth, and civil society are essential to rebuilding a nation that has known too much conflict and too little trust. We note that women remain underrepresented in governance, despite clear commitments under the revitalized agreement. We call for their full, equal, meaningful, and safe participation, including in constitutional, electoral, transitional justice processes, and peace building. Slovenia also underlines the need for meaningful participation and leadership of young people as active partners in peace building, conflict prevention, and governance. The youth of South Sudan deserve to inherit a state that values their voices and gives them the opportunities to build a peaceful future. Mr. President, in this Council, Slovenia has often spoken for those without a voice, for civilians under fire, for humanitarians under threat, for peacekeepers under attack. We do so, including in South Sudan, out of conviction that protecting life is not an act of charity, but a duty of law and conscience. We have heard many times that South Sudan remains at a crossroad, ultimately between the choice of politics as a contest of power or politics as a service to peace. Slovenia stands and will continue to stand with people of South Sudan on their path toward durable peace and stability. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Slovenia for her statement. I give the floor to the representative of Pakistan.
Thank you, Mr. President. We thank Under-Secretary General Lacroix, Executive Director Seema Bahus, and Dr. Derso for their briefings. President, these briefings highlight the indispensable role of the United Nations for peace and stability in South Sudan. They also underline the critical need to build trust and resume dialogue among the parties. And they also stress how crucial it is for this Council and the international community to maintain political commitment and support with necessary resources, including for peacekeeping and humanitarian needs in South Sudan. We also take careful note of the Secretary General's latest report. Its central message is clear. The revitalized agreement remains the only viable framework to prevent relapse into wider conflict and to guide South Sudan towards inclusive governance and credible elections in December 2026. Pakistan stands firmly with the people of South Sudan in their quest for peace, stability, and development. We acknowledge the steps taken by the government of South Sudan to engage with the United Nations mission in South Sudan, the African Union, and the Intergovernmental Authority on Development and other partners in addressing the challenges faced by the country. The recent visit of the AU Peace and Security Council to Juba and active efforts of the AU C5 Committee manifest regional leadership and African ownership. We are concerned by the erosion of power-sharing arrangements and escalation of hostilities that have caused civilian harm, displacement, and impediments to humanitarian access. These are fundamentally political challenges that require political solutions. We therefore urge all parties to de-escalate, to recommit to the 2017 cessation of hostilities agreement, and to return to an inclusive dialogue process. In this spirit, we support appeals by African Union and others for release of First Vice President Riek Machar and other detained opposition figures to help restore trust and enable full implementation of the revitalized agreement. President, the dire humanitarian situation in the country is compounded by conflict, severe flooding, and a protracted cholera outbreak, besides the spillover of the war in Sudan. We call on donors to urgently resource the humanitarian response plan that is only 30% funded, and call on all actors to protect humanitarian personnel and respect international humanitarian law. UNMISS continues to play a stabilizing role through protection of civilians, local peace-building initiatives, and support for humanitarian access. Pakistan pays tribute to the sacrifices of UNMISS peacekeepers, including our own contingent, whose engineering units have built and maintained 80 kilometers of dikes protecting thousands of people in flood-affected areas. Such tangible contributions underscore the importance of an adequately resourced mission. We call on the host government to cooperate fully with UNMISS and fulfill its obligations under the SOFA. We note the ongoing implementation for contingency planning in light of the current liquidity crisis. Any reduction in resources must not compromise core tasks such as protection of civilians, facilitation of humanitarian delivery, or support to the peace process. The mission's ability to adapt flexibly to evolving realities while maintaining robust presence in sensitive areas will be crucial in the months ahead. Pakistan reaffirms its support for an African-led, regionally anchored approach in full respect of South Sudan's sovereignty, unity, and territorial integrity. We believe that with genuine political will, regional solidarity, and sustained international support, South Sudan can fulfill the promise of peace and stability for its people. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Pakistan for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Mr. President, we are grateful to Under-Secretary General, Mr. Jean-Pierre Lacroix, and to the Executive Director of UN Women, Ms. Sima Bahous, for the information they provided us with. We have listened to the representative of civil society, Mr. Solomon Derso. We welcome the participation of the representative of South Sudan in today's meeting. The situation in South Sudan, unfortunately, is far from stable. Its recent escalation is a cause for serious concern. Clashes between government forces and opposition supporters are leading to increase in the number of casualties, including among civilians. Hostilities have spread across vast areas. The dire humanitarian situation in the country is exacerbated by frequent natural disasters, the influx of hundreds of thousands of refugees, and returning South Sudanese nationals. We are alarmed by reports suggesting that South Sudanese territory may be used as a platform to support one side in the conflict in neighboring Sudan. We firmly believe that maintaining strong neighborly relations between the two countries serves their mutual interests. In this regard, we caution external actors against using certain tensions between Port Sudan and Juba so as to advance confrontational agendas in Sudanese and South Sudanese affairs. We see a path to sustainable stabilization in South Sudan. We see that it lies through coordinated efforts by the African community aimed at peacefully resolving the current military and political crisis. We highly value the mediation efforts made by the African Union and IGAD, and we are convinced that individual states trusted by Port Sudan in Juba can play a constructive role. Also, those who are in support of initiatives from individual states. It's important to offer South Sudanese solutions that are coherent and adapted to the changed domestic political landscape, solutions that do not undermine the unity, sovereignty, and territorial integrity of the country. And we hope that the government of South Sudan and the opposition, with the support of continental countries, will demonstrate political wisdom, will be able to halt further escalation of armed conflict, and return to the logic of the revitalized peace agreement on the resolution of the conflict in the Republic of South Sudan, including the formation of unified armed forces as a guarantee of progress in the peace process. The issue of the timeline for this process is something that we are firmly convinced should be left to Juba's discretion. We believe the Council is capable of showing trust in the youngest member of the United Nations, giving it time and space to maneuver, rather than demanding immediate progress in establishing democratic institutions based on Western models. It is important to consider here that hasty and ill-conceived political steps risk reigniting internal violence and instability with renewed force. A significant component of the country's progress towards peace is the work that's done by the UN mission in South Sudan. We note that the mission has been given the broadest mandate and is successfully fulfilling the absolute majority of its assigned tasks. We strongly condemn any acts of violence against peacekeepers, against humanitarian workers, and against civilians. We expect that despite the current financial difficulties, UNMISS will continue to effectively support the implementation of the revitalized peace agreement. However, there are limits to such budget cuts. Maintaining the same mandate while expecting that the mission is going to continue carrying out a wide range of stabilization tasks and continually reducing its resources is not something that can continue forever. We are convinced that the UN presence in South Sudan should continue in close cooperation with the country's government so as to support reforms and strengthen sustainable institutions that are acceptable to all South Sudanese. Once again, we would like to highlight the harmful nature of the arms embargo currently in place against South Sudan. This regime, which representatives of the African continent, including within the Security Council, have called to review or ease, is the main obstacle to forming and equipping the country's unified army. It is clear that the existing exemptions from the embargo regime are insufficient to address the large-scale task of strengthening national security, and we will consistently advocate to have the regime eased or completely dismantled. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for her statement. I give the floor to the representative of Panama.
Thank you, Mr. President. Panama would like to is grateful for the updates that we received from Madame Sima Bahous and from Monsieur Jean-Pierre Lacroix, as well as the briefing from Dr. Solomon Ayele Derso. Thank you for those briefings. We also recognize the representative of South Sudan at the meeting. Panama observes with deep concern the continued erosion of the agreements reached under the framework of the 2018 revitalized peace agreement. Recent reports indicate that the political and security landscape continues to be unfavorable, affecting the reconstituted transitional government of national unity and undermining the spirit of inclusiveness that the agreement seeks to promote. The prolonged detention of First Vice President Riek Machar and other senior officials, followed by the ongoing trial, demands that any judicial proceedings fully comply with international standards of due process, impartiality and transparency. We call upon all parties to prioritize inclusive dialogue. This is the only viable path to resolve the political and security challenges in the country. On the other hand, the humanitarian situation in South Sudan remains critical. According to the Integrated Food Security Phase Classification, IPC, more than 5 million people face high levels of acute food insecurity, including 1.3 million in conditions of either emergency or extreme risk. The World Food Programme notes that these famine levels are driven by escalating recent events, massive displacement, restrictions on humanitarian access, the economic crisis, climate impacts, and the erosion of community resilience. Panama is concerned as we see the impacts of extreme climate events and the effect that they have on food security, on livelihoods, and access to basic services. The integration of climate resilience strategies into humanitarian and development efforts is essential to protect the civilian population. In this context, children are being gravely affected by hunger and violence. The reconstituted Joint Monitoring and Evaluation Commission has warned about the continued forced recruitment of minors by armed groups. Recruiting a child undermines their development, destabilizes communities, and violates international humanitarian law. Panama also expresses concern over the situation for women and girls who continue to face the persistent threat of sexual and gender-based violence, as well as the lack of services for survivors. Regarding women's participation in governance processes, we value the efforts made by UNMISS to strengthen their involvement and reiterate the need to ensure safe, inclusive and enabling environments, unhindered environments that allow women to contribute fully to peace building and decision making in the country. We also would stress the importance of carrying out the planned elections in a free, impartial, transparent manner. We reiterate our support for the UNMISS mission and all of its personnel whose work is essential to protect civilians, promote inclusive governance, and advance towards sustainable peace. Panama highlights the recent visit of this Council to Addis Ababa and the constructive dialogue held with the African Union Peace and Security Council on the situation in South Sudan. The sustained attention of regional actors is essential to keep channels of dialogue and monitoring open, preventing further fragmentation of the peace process. In this regard, we welcome diplomatic efforts aimed at reactivating the implementation of the revitalized agreement, recognizing that sustained and coordinated action is key to consolidating peace in South Sudan. In conclusion, Panama reaffirms its conviction that only an inclusive political process free from hostilities and violence, grounded in the rule of law, the protection of human rights, and guarantees of security for its population will allow the attainment of the lasting peace that this young nation so urgently needs. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Panama for the statement. I give the floor to the representative of Denmark.
Thank you, Mr. President. And I also thank our briefers for their comprehensive briefings, and I welcome the presence of the permanent representative of South Sudan in the chamber here today. Mr. President, the revitalized peace agreement has been deliberately undermined for the past 7 years. the erosion of political trust, and intensifying violence continues to deter any prospects for a lasting peace for the people of South Sudan. I have 3 messages. First, with elections barely 13 months away, we see a troubling lack of commitment to key provisions in the peace agreement, leaving several pivotal tasks yet to be fulfilled. In some regions, conditions resemble a return to civil war. The entrenched culture of winner takes it all is eroding hope for political remediation or improved well-being for the people of South Sudan. Systemic mismanagement has led to public resources being converted into private power. This is depriving citizens of their most basic right, fragmenting the patchworks of governments and leading to local struggles, corruption, and misery. The detention of First Vice President Machar and other opposition figures are actions that undermine the peace agreement. The judiciary in charge of the case must exhibit independence, transparency, and ensure proper due process. We call for an inclusive political dialogue to unite the South Sudanese in meaningful dialogue and to build national consensus on the future of the country. Second, with almost 8 million facing acute food insecurity in South Sudan with a risk of famine, the humanitarian and human rights crisis is dire, disproportionately affecting women and children. We continue to be alarmed by the sharp increase in conflict-related sexual violence. We reiterate our call for holding the perpetrators accountable and recall the obligation for all actors to comply with international humanitarian law and human rights law. The transitional government of South Sudan must urgently address the humanitarian crisis by allocating maximum resources to meet basic needs of its population. Further, we strongly urge the government to ensure unimpeded humanitarian access for the UN and NGOs to civilians in need across South Sudan. The international community and donors must also scale up their support for the 2025 Humanitarian Response Plan, which remains underfunded. Third and final point. Denmark expresses its unwavering support for UNMISS in its endeavors to fulfill its mandate. With an extremely fragile situation in South Sudan, we're deeply concerned about the impact of the liquidity crisis on UNMISS' ability to fulfill its mandate. We pay tribute to the troops who put their lives at risk every day to carry out their important task in a constantly changing and complex environment. UNMISS must be able to operate without interference or imposed conditions. Denmark therefore strongly urges the transitional government of South Sudan to engage fully and constructively with the mission and to respect the status of forces agreement. To conclude, authorities of South Sudan must respect the dignity, well-being, and fundamental rights of their people. We call on the transitional government to act accordingly, demonstrating through concrete action a genuine commitment to peace, accountability, and the protection of all civilians. Denmark remains a steadfast partner in supporting the people of South Sudan on their path towards a peaceful and democratic future. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Denmark for the statement, and I give the floor to the representative of China.
President, I thank USG Lacroix and Executive Director Bahous for their briefings. I've also listened carefully to the statement by Mr. Derso. I welcome the participation of the Permanent Representative of South Sudan at today's meeting. In the more than 10 years since its independence, South Sudan has repeatedly experienced ravages of war, causing great suffering to its people. The peace that has prevailed since the signing of the revitalized agreement is hard-won and should be cherished. The political process in South Sudan ultimately depends on the government and people of South Sudan. The support and assistance of the international community are indispensable. We must work together to help this young country to move steadily forward on the path to peace and development. In the light of the Secretary General's report, I wish to make 4 points. 1. National stability must be maintained. The current security situation in South Sudan is worrying, with localized conflicts and crossfire occurring from time to time. China urges all parties to focus on the overall situation of peace and stability in the country, effectively cease hostilities, protect civilians and humanitarian workers, and in particular, prevent the cycles of violence from escalating out of control. We call on all parties to resolve their differences through inclusive dialogue and encourage greater unity and peaceful coexistence among various communities. The international community should do more to promote peace and stability and avoid fueling tension. 2. The political process should be advanced. China welcomes the announcement by the government of South Sudan of its intention to relaunch the Tumani initiative process and the progress made by South Sudan in the expansion of the judiciary and restoration of local courts. We call on all parties to stay committed to the revitalized agreement, strive to transcend political differences, and find the greatest common denominator to implement in an orderly manner the arrangements for the deployment of necessary unified forces, drafting of the constitution, and preparations for the general elections so as to steadily push forward political transition. 3. Regional mediation efforts should be intensified. China has always firmly believed that the key to solving Africa's problem lies in the hands of Africa. We support close coordination between the UN, the African Union, IGAD, and other regional organizations in stepping up mediation efforts, innovating mediation models, encouraging all parties to return to the political dialogue. Any solution should safeguard the sovereignty and ownership of South Sudan and fully respect its concerns. Any governance model imposed will not take root in local soil. Interference and sanctions will only be counterproductive. China supports the Security Council heeding the calls of African countries to timely adjust or lift the sanctions on South Sudan. 4. Economic and livelihood development should be promoted. South Sudan has a single-structure economy with a relatively weak economic foundation. As a result of the spillover effects of the conflicts in Sudan and the flooding during the rainy season, the number of displaced persons is increasing and humanitarian situations becoming increasingly dire. China calls on the international community to increase support, providing humanitarian assistance to address the symptoms and development cooperation to tackle the root causes, so as to help stabilize its economy and livelihood, improve the well-being of its people, and support South Sudan in taking the path of independent and sustainable development. President, China is the main troop contributing country to UNMISS. Over the years, Chinese peacekeepers have stepped forward and fulfilled their duties with utmost dedication and professionalism, even sacrificing their precious lives. Their outstanding performance has earned the recognition of the UN and the host country. Through their actions, they have exemplified the noble mission of the Blue Helmets. China appreciates and supports the work of the VSISJ, HISOM, and will, as always, support UNMISS in fulfilling its mandate. UNMISS has played an important role in maintaining domestic peace in South Sudan and supporting the implementation of the revitalized agreement. Its role should be strengthened rather than weakened. At a time when missions are generally under pressure to reduce expenditures, we support the government of South Sudan, the United Nations Secretariat, and UNMISS in continuing to uphold the spirit of cooperation, addressing specific issues encountered in the implementation of the mission's mandate through friendly consultations, so that UNMISS can better perform its duties efficiently and cost-effectively, play a greater role in maintaining peace within South Sudan and advancing the political process. Thank you, President.
I thank the representative of China for the statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Greece.
Mr. President, I thank USG for Peace Operations Jean-Pierre Lacroix and Executive Director for Women Sima Bahous for their insightful briefings. I also thank Dr. Derso of Amani Africa for his remarks. I would like to highlight 3 key points regarding the ongoing situation in South Sudan. First, Greece remains deeply concerned about the continued erosion of the power-sharing arrangements established under the revitalized agreement. Unilateral decisions, including the dismissal and replacement of Sudan People's Liberation Movement Army in Opposition officials, the creation of parallel administrative structures, and the ongoing of the first Vice President Machar trial seriously undermined trust among the parties. These developments weakened the spirit of inclusivity and compromise that the agreement was meant to preserve, and risk reversing the fragile gains achieved since its signing. Greece calls on all stakeholders to refrain from unilateral measures, to fully respect the provisions of the revitalized agreement, and to resume a genuine dialogue as the only viable path toward national reconciliation and lasting stability. We also encourage IGAD and the African Union as guarantors of the peace process to intensify their engagement and ensure adherence to the commitments undertaken by all signatories. Second, according to the Secretary General's report, the security situation in Upper Nile and Equatoria continues to deteriorate, marked by renewed clashes between the South Sudan People's Defense Forces and SPLM-AIO. These confrontations have led to civilian casualties and large-scale displacement. Greece strongly condemns all violations of the 2017 Cessation of Hostilities Agreement and echoes the Secretary General's call for an immediate cessation of armed confrontations. We are equally alarmed by reports of arbitrary arrests, extrajudicial executions, and restrictions on civic and political space. Respect for human rights, the rule of law, and due process is indispensable for restoring public confidence and achieving sustainable peace. In this regard, Greece welcomes the recent expansion of the judiciary and the adoption of a new code of conduct as important steps towards strengthening judicial integrity and accountability. Third, the consistently high number of grave violations against children in South Sudan is deeply concerning, predominantly recruitment and use, abduction, and killing and maiming. Attacks on schools and hospitals, as well as the military use of these facilities, continue to deprive children of their basic rights and safety. Both non-state actors and government security forces bear responsibility for these violations. Excuse me. Greece calls on all parties to the conflict to immediately end and prevent all grave violations against children and to release the children that still remain in their ranks. We also call the government to ensure accountability for perpetrators of all violations. And in this regard, we commend UNMISS for its work and especially for its ongoing child protection initiatives. Mr. President, Greece reiterates also its strong commitment to advancing the WPS agenda in South Sudan. Women remain underrepresented in leadership, holding only around 20% of positions, despite the 35% target set by the revitalized agreement. Echoing the earlier joint statement on WPS, Greece reaffirms its support for the full, equal, and meaningful participation of women in all political and peace processes. Sustainable peace cannot be achieved without their leadership, protection, and empowerment. Finally, Greece reaffirms its steadfast support for the work of Special Representative Nicholas Haysom and the continued presence of UNMISS. Its role in facilitating the peace process, monitoring human rights, and enabling humanitarian access remains essential and irreplaceable. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Greece for the statement, and I give the floor to the representative of the Republic of Korea.
Thank you, Mr. President. I thank USG Lacroix, USG Bauhaus, and Executive Director Derso for their informative briefings. I also welcome the participation of the representative of South Sudan in this meeting. 12 years ago, the Republic of Korea demonstrated its special commitment to South Sudan by deploying its military engineering troops known as the Hanbin Unit. At the time, we sincerely believed that rebuilding communities would help lay down the groundwork for lasting peace. More than a decade has now passed, yet elections remain overdue. The revitalized peace agreement is under mounting strain amid deepening political friction, and renewed violence continues to worsen humanitarian suffering. In this context in mind, I'd like to highlight 3 points today. First, it's time for parties to rekindle the spirit of the revitalized agreement, a spirit of compromise, trust, and shared responsibility to restore political confidence. Only when the key parties to revitalize the agreement sit down together on equal terms can make any political process in South Sudan to move forward. We note with concern the suspension of first Vice President, who is one of the 2 primary signatories to the agreement. The unilateral dismissal of the senior SPLM-IO officials and parallel governance structures between SPLM and SPLM-IO are not merely political disagreement. They are fractures that risk institutional collapse. We therefore urge all parties to return to genuine good faith dialogue so that they can be fully prepared for free and fair election next year. It's important that these elections take place as scheduled and should stand as a defining moment for Sudan, South Sudan, to demonstrate genuine inclusivity and national unity. Second, political process cannot be sustained in the absence of security stabilization. The continued armed clashes between SS-PDF and SPLO-IO, including the use of indiscriminated aerial bombing, constitute a violation of ceasefire and a grave threat to civilians. All parties must immediately cease acts of violence and recommit to full implementation of the security provisions of the revitalized agreement. This includes the second phase of necessary unified force training. In this connection, the role of the UNMISS remains indispensable in fulfilling its mandate to protect civilians. We strongly condemn the repeated attacks against mission, as well as the obstruction of its implementation of continuous plan amid the ongoing liquidity crisis. We urge South Sudanese authority to fully cooperate with the mission. Third, civilians remain the first to suffer and the last to be protected in South Sudanese conflict. Ongoing violence and lack of humanitarian access are worsening already dire situation, marked by massive displacement, severe food insecurity, climate-induced flooding, and the worst cholera outbreak in the country's history. We also strongly condemn the increasing attack on humanitarian workers, including recent looting of nutrition supplies from a humanitarian helicopter. Safe and hindered humanitarian access must be guaranteed. To help alleviate these conditions, we call for stronger international humanitarian support. For our part, Korea is working with various UN funds and programs to protect survivors of conflict-related sexual violence and to support peace-building activities. Mr. President, as I recalled at the outset, Korea has contributed troops to South Sudan for many years, driven by the hope that the country would one day be able to stand on its own and take the path toward lasting peace. Peacekeeping can buy time, but cannot buy will. The next step rests with South Sudanese themselves. The international partners, including Korea, who has stood with South Sudanese people will continue support. Now, responsibility must be matched by results. Thank you.
I thank the representative of the Republic of Korea for the statement. I shall now make a statement in my capacity as the representative of Sierra Leone. Distinguished colleagues, I have the honor to deliver this statement on behalf of the A3+ members, namely Algeria, Guyana, Somalia, and my country, Sierra Leone. We thank USG Jean-Pierre Lacroix, the UN Women Executive Director, Ms. Sima Bahous, and Dr. Solomon Dresso for their comprehensive briefings. We acknowledge the Secretary General's report on the situation in South Sudan and welcome the participation of the representative of South Sudan in this meeting. The A3+ remains deeply concerned by persistent political and security challenges in South Sudan, which have been further exacerbated by regional instability, particularly the spillover effect from the conflict in Sudan. From the conflict in Sudan, economic and climate shocks, food insecurity, and a growing humanitarian catastrophe. Efforts by UNMISS to provide neutral, technical, and logistical support to the South Sudanese transitional government towards the implementation of the 2018 Revitalized Agreement, including peace process benchmarks and electoral preparations, remain crucial. The strengthened presence of UNMISS, even amidst the ongoing political deadlock, increased violence affecting the civilians and humanitarian workers, and growing access restrictions hampering humanitarian aid delivery, is more important than ever before. The A3+ wishes to underscore 4 points. First, we underline the need for sustained funding to support the peacekeeping mission, humanitarian aid, and political processes that underpin the peace agreement's full implementation and transition towards democratic elections. South Sudan needs sustained technical and logistical support to help navigate the difficult political and security situation in the country. Scaling down the operational presence of UNMISS will put the prospect of durable peace in South Sudan in jeopardy. The A3+ joins the call from the Secretary General in urging the international community to address UNMISS funding crisis to sustain peacekeeping efforts, which are essential for the country's stability. The A3+ is profoundly alarmed by the difficult financial situation of UN peacekeeping operations, including UNMISS, and its 15% reduction in expenditure, which will necessitate the repatriation of approximately 25% of uniformed personnel and equipment, significantly affecting the mission's operations. The budget cuts are expected to negatively impact UNMISS's ability to operate, including potential closures of some bases and a reduction in personnel. We further echo the request from the AU Peace and Security Council following its meeting of 28 October on the situation in South Sudan, directed to the chairs of IGAD and the AU Commission, as well as the call by the Secretary General of the United Nations to collaborate with the board of the Special Reconstruction Fund towards convening the South Sudan Pledging Conference with a view to mobilizing financial resources. Second, South Sudan is at a turning point, evidenced by consistent violations of the revitalized peace agreement, lack of progress on key provisions, the erosion of power-sharing arrangements, and unilateral dismissals and replacements. Intensified clashes, mainly between the South Sudan People's Defense Forces and opposition SPLM-AIO forces since March 2025, has resulted in numerous civilian deaths, mass displacement, and destruction of infrastructure. The permanent ceasefire has been repeatedly violated, undermining the successful implementation of the 2018 Revitalized Peace Agreement. The A3+ is therefore extremely concerned about the current political challenges in South Sudan, and we call upon the government to take steps to address the ongoing political impasse. The A3+ demands that First Vice President Riek Machar and the other individuals charged receive a fair trial in accordance with applicable legal procedures. We strongly urge all parties to the revitalized peace agreement to place the supreme interests of the people of South Sudan and the country above all else, and to address peacefully all challenges facing the implementation of the agreement. We also strongly urge all parties to honor the extended transition timelines. We call on the parties to the conflict to cease hostilities and take immediate de-escalatory measures, including addressing localized military confrontations in the country through dialogue rather than force. We applaud the efforts undertaken by the African Union to resolve the impasse, especially the visit by the African Union Peace and Security Council and the African Union Commission, albeit with the continuation of the political impasse. In this connection, the A3+ strongly calls for the full implementation of the revitalized peace agreement. We commend the holding of the 4th extraordinary meeting of the reconstituted Joint Monitoring and Evaluation Commission last October. We welcome the steps outlined in the RJMEC to break the current deadlock, urgently address the ongoing crisis, and return to the implementation of the peace agreement. The A3+ regrets that the planned visit to South Sudan and Uganda by the 2206 committee has been blocked due to an objection from one permanent member. We reiterate our call for the reinvigorated coordination of international, regional, and sub-regional mediation initiatives to salvage the peace process in South Sudan. Third, we are profoundly alarmed by the scale and scope of human rights violations, including conflict-related violence, abductions, and child recruitment, as highlighted in the Secretary General's report. We urge the stakeholders in South Sudan to take concrete measures to end impunity by holding perpetrators accountable for their actions without exception. The escalation of this conflict underscores the need for the hybrid court to ensure accountability, promote deterrence, and encourage sustainable peace based on justice. Accountability for violence should be a critical component in any political settlement. Building towards justice and reconciliation and contributing to reconciling the people of South Sudan should be the genuine aim of the international community, requiring sustained diplomatic and political effort and political will. We therefore underscore the urgent need to take administrative and legal steps to ensure the establishment of the hybrid court for South Sudan, even as we welcome the Chief Justice's Judicial Strategic Plan, the posting of over 60 judges nationwide, and the re-establishment of high court benches in several counties. Fourth and finally, timely funding of the humanitarian response is critical to saving countless lives and preventing further suffering in South Sudan. Despite some generous contributions, the overall donor response to the humanitarian crisis has been far less than required. We therefore encourage increased and sustained international funding to support humanitarian aid efforts in South Sudan. As we reiterate our call for enhanced humanitarian funding for South Sudan, we also underline our call on South Sudan to ensure the enabling environment that will facilitate access, protection, and unhindered movement of humanitarian workers throughout the country. We urge the government of South Sudan to actively pursue measures that guarantee the protection and respect of humanitarian staff, installations, and operations, which are vital to allowing delivery of needed humanitarian assistance. The safety and security of aid workers, both national and international, as well as aid supplies and assets, must be guaranteed and respected. Aid workers must be free to work wherever assistance is needed, without fear of attack or restrictions placed on them by parties to the conflict. Noting the overall picture presented by the 90-day report on the situation in South Sudan, we believe that South Sudan stands at the cusp of a turning point, one that may usher in a moment of national unity and sustainable development, or a relapse in another cycle of violence, derailing a carefully crafted peace agreement and power-sharing measures that allow for peaceful coexistence. The continued presence of UNMISS remains critical to the facilitation of peaceful engagement and to averting further violence. In closing, the A3+ reaffirms its unwavering support for the sovereignty, independence, unity, and territorial integrity of South Sudan. We stand in solidarity with the government and people in their quest for lasting peace, stability, and development. We commend the African Union, including the Panel of the Wise and the C5, as well as IGAD for their continued engagement in support of these objectives. I thank you. I resume my function as President of the Council. I now give the floor to the representative of South Sudan.
Mr. President, distinguished members of the Security Council, good morning to you all. The Republic of South Sudan wishes to express its sincere appreciation to this United Nations Security Council for its continued engagement and support for the peace process, stability, development in our country. We also thank the Secretary General, the Undersecretary General Lacroix, Executive Director Sema, and the civil society representative. Lacroix, I cannot say enough, with as much trips you've taken to South Sudan and as much conversation you've had with our government officials. We appreciate you, and we know that the peace operation is going through critical juncture at the moment, but with all of our support, we will continue to overcome them. The government of South Sudan reaffirms its unwavering commitment to the full implementation of the revitalized peace agreement of the conflict in the Republic of South Sudan, despite the numerous challenges in which all of you here have mentioned. The revitalized peace agreement remains the only way out of the transition and the only way into stability in South Sudan. We remain steadfast in pursuing peace, reconciliation, and institutional reform of our government so that we could complete this transitional period, including the unification of armed forces, judicial reform, and the establishment of key transitional institutions. Mr. President, the recent administrative changes within the government structure has been carried out in accordance with South Sudan's sovereign, prerogative, and national laws. These adjustments are intended to enhance efficiency, promote accountability, and ensure stability during the transition. We categorically reject any criticization of these measures as undermining the peace process. Rather, they are part of the ongoing efforts to strengthen governance and promote inclusivity at all levels. The government of South Sudan remains committed to maintaining the permanent ceasefire and reiterate that the government does not condone attacks against humanitarian workers or UN personnel. We call upon the signatories to the peace process and the peace agreement to exercise restraint and refrain from inflammatory actions and re-engage constructively through the mechanism established under the RXS that we see as the only way out of this transitional period and into a stable nation. Individuals that have been charged or are being in the process of the courts are not to take away from the continuation of the revitalized peace agreement. The government recognizes the magnitude of the humanitarian challenges facing our nation. The effects of climate change, the regional instability, and the conflict in the neighboring Sudan, to mention a few, continue to hinder our situation in the country. But we continue to welcome as many humanitarians as we can. And with the limited resources we've had, we've welcomed everybody from Sudan and have opened our borders and have remained very neutral in the crisis in Sudan. And we intend to continue to do so. We condemn any attacks on humanitarian workers and emphasize that perpetrators of such acts will be held accountable under the South Sudanese laws. The government of South Sudan reaffirms its dedication to advancing women's participation in the national government and the state government. While the 35% representation targets under the RCS has not been yet fully achieved in all of our levels of our government, concrete steps have been taken into improving inclusivity, including through the appointments of state and national levels by strengthening gender-sensitive policies. We have 2 vice presidents that are females, and we have 41 representation of females in the cabinet. Mr. President, South Sudan remains committed to partnering with the United Nations and appreciates the continued presence and support of UNMISS. We take note of the current financial constraints affecting peacekeeping operations and urge that any adjustment to UNMISS structure or presence carried out in close consultations. It's carried out in close consultation with the government of South Sudan and in the manner that preserves the nation's ability to fulfill its mandate. We also reiterate the importance of mutual respect of the status forces agreement and the sovereignty of South Sudan. The challenges, the government will continue to engage with UNMISS leadership to resolve any operational challenges through constructive dialogue. For the start, when the government suggested the 17 points to UNMISS to remain, and for the UNMISS to remain in the three capitals of Juba, Malakal, and Wau, this was meant in good faith and for the stability in mind. It was not in any way a condition for UNMISS to continue its work. Mr. President, we understand that South Sudan stands today at a critical juncture. We are determined not to return to conflict, but to move forward towards a lasting peace and unity and development. We therefore call on our regional and international partners to continue their support. We understand that this has been a very long process, but as we always say, peace is never a race that will be ending, but it's a process that will continue. And with all of your support here at the UN and with the African Union and with the IGAD, we continue to appreciate every step that has been taken, every visit that has been taken to South Sudan, and every phone call that has been made. Let us work together to ensure that South Sudan's transitional period concludes in peace, stability, and a democratic renewal in the interests of the people of South Sudan and the broader region. I thank you for your kind attention.
I thank the representative of South Sudan for the statement. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. I now invite Council members to informal consultations to continue our discussion on the subject. The meeting is adjourned.